welcome to Good Grief, the podcast dedicated to demystifying and destigmatizing grief with compassion and humor. I'm Nikki. I'm an end-of-life doula and a grief coach in Columbus, Ohio. And today we're going to talk about ambiguous grief. Ooh, okay. So, what the heck is ambiguous grief? Glad you asked. Well, I will say that ambiguous grief is very, very similar to anticipatory grief, which I've recently had an episode on that. You can go back and listen to it, but this is definitely something different. Anticipatory grief is more a prime example, a really good example that describes it the best is when you're grieving somebody with a terminal diagnosis, be it somebody around you or yourself, that you know a loss is coming and you're grieving it before it's happened because it's inevitable. But ambiguous grief is a little bit different. A good way to describe it would be someone who is with you, not dying, but has had some sort of massive change, some sort of giant shift in their life. Their well-being, their mental or physical state. There are a lot of things that might happen that would cause ambiguous grief. Good examples that are the most common would be addiction, dementia, like especially beginning stages of dementia. That's a little gray. That could still be considered anticipatory grief, but depending on how bad it is or what type of dementia they have, they could be with you for a very, very long time yet. But also things like traumatic brain injuries, mental health crises, severe mental illness diagnoses, things like that. So, and I'm going to get into some other examples down the road, but that's just some ideas so you can get a little picture in your brain as to what the heck we're talking about with ambiguous grief. And if you, it's a little bit like disenfranchised grief, that if it's one of the things you haven't exactly experienced yourself, it can be really hard to understand or grasp. And one of those things where you can be like, well, why the heck are you grieving this? Nobody's dead, blah, blah, blah. Or, maybe it's the person you're grieving is still there, but they don't, quote, look sick. They don't act sick. But overall, there's something there that has changed, something that is different, and you are grieving that change or that loss. We'll get into that a little more. This sounds really abstract, right? This is really kind of nebulous and gray. But if it's happening to you, it's very real and you understand it. So if you've been through this, you probably are like, yeah, I know exactly what the heck you're talking about. If you haven't, I'm going to try to explain this a little bit better. But overall, it's a bit like disenfranchised grief or other griefs. It's you're mourning the loss of something, be it a lifestyle change or the way things, quote unquote, used to be. And these could be with yourself as well. Again, I'll get into some more examples and we'll dive, a little bit deeper into each one as we go. Let's use dementia as an example, because that's one that is a little more common that people seem to know a little bit more about. So you have a loved one that is living with you who now has dementia. You're kind of starting your anticipatory grief. There's also an ambiguous grief because that person is still with you. They might not even be displaying symptoms just yet, but certain things are going away, like their ability to drive, or, they're getting lost more frequently. So you now have to drive them anywhere they need to go. So there's a little bit of loss of freedom there. And that's one thing. But more than that, you're firsthand witnessing somebody becoming a different person. And they aren't going to be that person you married or that you grew up with or has been in your life for a period of time, regardless of your relationship. It doesn't feel the same. It's now becoming, especially if it's a spouse. In the trainings I've had in dealing with people with dementia, obviously you don't treat them like children because they're not. They're adults and they're human beings and they deserve respect and to be treated as such. But when you enter the role as a caregiver versus a spouse or a partner, your role shifts and your relationship changes. And they're still your partner, they're still your spouse, but you're also now their caregiver. And I don't want to confuse it with a parent-child role because those are very different things. But you are now more of a caregiver than you used to be for them. You're handling a lot of their day-to-day needs and you're taking care of them more because they can't take care of themselves. So there's a little bit of, and again, especially with the case of dementia, this does go into anticipatory grief a little bit. This is very gray, I know. But if we move away from that, pick a different topic. Like let's say traumatic brain injury or severe PTSD. This is something that has happened with spouses of those in the military when they come back after being deployed and they have very severe PTSD. Their relationship has changed. The person is still there, they're still with them, and they might even still be functioning, but they now have this diagnosis and this pain and this set of symptoms that is coming back with them, and they might be a totally different person than when they left. This is why so many marriages tend to fall apart after deployment. I don't have an exact percentage. I don't have the statistics in front of me. Okay, I lied. I've got the internet right in front of me. I'm staring at my computer, so I pulled it up. And this is from the Armed Forces Insurance, AFI.org, press release in 2021. Let's see. So this was from 2019. This is when this was reported. Deployed military members in the Navy, Marines, Air Force have a higher than average divorce rates. Air Force with the highest at 14.6%, and the Navy at over 12.5%, and the other two branches as high as 8%. Now, this study doesn't specifically say it has to do with PTSD. This is just divorce rates after deployment of military members. But okay, so that aside, there tends to be a higher rate of divorce rates after a deployment, and I would surmise a lot of this might have to do with PTSD, but even if there is no formal diagnosis, a lot of times when somebody comes back from something like that, their personality has changed. They've been through something that their partner has not. They see the world differently now than their partner may. And so their visions, their values, their lives might not align anymore. So there might be, the end of a relationship at that point. But if there is the case of severe PTSD, that's when there's a personality shift. And it's not the fault of anybody. It's not this person has now just become somebody different. They went through a trauma. And so their outlook, their life, everything around them has changed. And so they're a different person. And whether or not their partner chooses to stay with them, obviously that's their business. But, assuming they do stay together, it's going to be a different relationship. And that person is a different person. And there's a grief there that we don't have the same relationship or we don't have the same life. Everything isn't the same as before they left. They're still here. They're not dying. They're not dead, but they're a different person and everything has shifted. So that's another beautiful example of ambiguous grief. Some other examples, a couple things that I have kind of thought of on my own here. As far as ambiguous grief for yourself, that can be a big one. I'll open myself up here. I am not afraid to share some of my own personal stories on this podcast, but in the last year or so, I've gone through a lot of health changes and physical changes with my body. And I've mentioned before, I went through training to be a personal trainer. Fitness and wellness has been a part of my life since I was in my late 20s, and I've always been a very physically fit person. I'll brag, I had six-pack abs for a little while. I was in peak physical condition for a good chunk of my life. And in the last couple of years, I had a couple mental health issues and I had some changes in my life and my body has changed. And it's really hard for me. I'm still in good health, but my body is different than it was. And I can't do things the same as I could. And some physical changes have happened to me. And it's hard. And there are days where I'm really depressed and really sad. I'm grieving that person I was, 4 years ago, when I think 2018 was probably, I would say that was my peak year of my life. Everything in my life was going so great at that point. And I'm not going to attribute it to my physical health, but that was a big part of it. I had a lot of great things going on in my life and a lot of the things have gone away. And because of that, my body has changed and my mentality has changed. Some of it for the better, some of it for the worse. I've discovered this new role in my life as becoming a doula and a grief coach and putting this passion as a main part of my life and not just something I think about from time to time. So it's not all bad, but there's definitely been some negative impacts. And I absolutely grieve that. I absolutely grieve the loss of that. And along with that, a lot of people, when they get to their middle age or as they are aging past middle age, when they get into their 70s and 80s, especially when you get into your early to mid 70s, sarcopenia starts to set in. Whether you like it or not, your muscle mass starts to go away and your body changes and you're weaker. And I'm not going to say that's everybody. Everybody's different. But a lot of people grieve those changes. They can't do what they used to do. They can't run up a flight of stairs like they used to. They have to take their time. They can't walk to the grocery store like they used to. Now they have to drive. Things like that. It's hard. And that is absolutely a grief. You've lost something that you had. You're not necessarily dying, but you've lost that. It's a huge change. Mental changes. Somebody who's gone through a mental health crisis. I've been open about my mental health issues in the past, and it seems like with every time I go through a big one, my personality shifts a little bit, and sometimes it's for the better, sometimes it's not. So, I absolutely grieve the person I was before each change in my life, but I also, I try to accept the good things that have come out of changes. So those are some other great examples of ambiguous grief. So with ambiguous grief, a lot of feelings and emotions and things are going to come out of this whole range of them. And as I always say, whatever it is normal, okay? Whatever it is you're feeling, even if it's happiness, if that's what you're feeling, it's valid. So your feelings are your own. But there could be absolutely feelings of guilt, sadness, depression, yearning. I mean, we talked about like you're grieving the loss of something because of a change. So there's going to be some sadness and yearning, but there might also be anger. Like you're angry at the army for deploying your husband and giving him PTSD and putting him through what he had to go through. And now he's this person. So there's anger there. Of course that's normal. That's absolutely normal to have that anger. When something changes and we don't like it, it's okay to get angry. That's normal. But guilt's a big thing too. Like, somebody in your life, traumatic brain injury or a mental health crisis, or especially an addiction, and you don't love them the same as you used to. And there's a guilt there, especially if they're hurting or they're suffering with something and you just don't feel the same feelings for them anymore. I mean, how crappy would that make? That would make me feel like an absolute jerk. But if you can't deny your own feelings, you have to respect yourself too. And I'm not going to get into that. I'm not going to tell anybody what to do with their relationships or how to feel. But it is normal if you're feeling guilty because you don't have the same feelings for somebody, or you're angry with them, or you're frustrated with them. If you're dealing with a parent who has severe dementia and they're the last stages of Alzheimer's, and you're just annoyed at them, you're angry at them, and you're just like, oh, I don't want to deal with them anymore. You're going to feel guilty for that because you're like, that's my mom or my dad or my partner and I love them, but you're so frustrated dealing with them and you're getting pissed off all the time. That's perfectly natural. So, and the guilt, I'll tell you, you don't need to feel it because whatever you're feeling is normal, but the feeling of guilt is normal too. I can't tell you not to feel guilty. If you're going to feel it. That's what it is. But it's normal. So, but along with this, a lot of people don't recognize that this is a grief. They may not recognize that what they're feeling is actually grief. They're just thinking, oh, I'm going through this thing. I don't, have the same life. My partner's changed everything. They may not recognize it. That's actually a grief. If we don't know it, then how do we deal with it? Right? Okay. But let's say now you do know it and you're ready to cope with it. What can we do when we're grieving somebody who's still alive and still with us, or ourselves? Step number one, and I will post a link to this article. There's an article where I got this concept from and where I'm reading this last bit from whatsyourgrief.com, which is Ambiguous Grief. Okay. First, remember that the present doesn't override the past. This is easier said than done. We know that. It's easy for you to just say this, but what's happening right now doesn't negate what has been in the past. Just because you're now a caregiver and not a spouse, well, you're still a spouse, but you know what I mean? You've stepped into a caregiver role for your partner. That doesn't take away everything that's happened in the past. So the past is always going to be there. It's just hanging out. As a grief coach, I don't deal with that much. I deal with the present and the future, but the past is always there. And so what you're going through right now doesn't mean the past didn't happen. Okay. Next, understand that the illness or the change, whatever, isn't the person. This can be really hard to see, really hard to accept when someone you love isn't the same person they used to be. Especially if it comes to, like I said, traumatic brain injury, PTSD, mental illness, dementia, any of those things. Whatever it is they have, the dementia, the PTSD is not them. They're still them. They are still there. They're still your person, your spouse, your mom, your dad, your friend. They might be slightly different. Their attitudes might change. They might, especially in the case of dementia towards the end, they might say awful things to you, but that's not them. And they are not their mental illness or their illness or their disease. They're still that person. They're still in there. And I know you might be feeling frustration and anger and guilt and everything else. That's normal. And that's just how you feel. But just remember that they are still them. They might be acting differently. They might have changed, but they're still them. Okay. Obviously, the next one, acknowledge the grief and pain of the loss. You have to accept it. Step 1 of the 12-step program, admit that you're powerless over alcohol or addiction, whatever. It's one I've always struggled with the most, but once you acknowledge that what you're feeling is grief and that you are hurting, you can start your journey forward. You have to give yourself permission to grieve, okay? If you can't do that, you're not going to get anywhere. And society might not view what you're dealing as their idea of grief. That's the whole disenfranchised grief we've talked about. Grief is so nebulous, and it's not all black and white. You're not doing just this type of grief. It's a lot of types of grief all at once. Grief is grief, right? But you need to acknowledge it so that you can start coping with it, working with it, and journeying with it. Okay. This is a good one. This next one, be open to a new type of relationship. The person that you love or yourself has changed. Everybody changes in their life. I'm not the same person I was when I was in my 20s, which is probably a good thing. I think most of us I think we grow mentally, emotionally, everything, more and more as we age. So we're not the same person we were 20 years ago. Maybe you are, that's okay. But if you or the person you love that we're talking about right now has changed, be open to this new person. They're still them. Like I said, the illness isn't the person. It's going to be a new relationship. That's why they say marriage is work. It might take work to kind of establish what this new person is, who this new person is, what they're like, and how you gel with them, how you work with them, how you be with them. It's not easy. I'm not going to say that. This is why so many marriages fail is I'm not saying people fail and they don't want to work at it. Sometimes you can't. And I'm divorced. I am divorced. I'm on my second marriage. So I will never ever preach that you can't, you're not working hard enough if a relationship fails by any stretch. It's a work though. It's really a lot of work. But being open, finding gratitude in this new relationship can be very helpful. So something to keep in mind. Last one, as always, connect with others who can relate. What am I always saying? Don't be afraid to ask for help. I have found group therapy more beneficial to me. This is me personally, more beneficial than individual counseling, always. Because there's a connection when you have people who are suffering or going through a similar type of thing you are. It's huge. Al-Anon was a big impact on my life when I was going to Al-Anon meetings. I haven't been to one in years, but every now and then I'm like, man, I should go. And I should. There's something beautiful and humbling about being in a room of other people who are going through the same thing you are. There are tons of support groups out there for caregivers with those with dementia. I know somebody personally in my life whose spouse has early onset, and she's struggling because there are not a lot of people her age dealing with this. It's a lot of older people. So when she has made those connections, it's been huge for her to find somebody her age that is going through the same type of process, because everybody's different, right? No two dementia patients are the same, and no two illnesses are ever the same. So everybody's going to be a little different, but knowing somebody's going through something very similar to you can be huge. So there is a link in the article I will link to another website for Pauline Boss. She's the woman who first kind of labeled and researched this exact topic of ambiguous loss. So I'll go ahead and link. That's ambiguousloss.com. I'll put it in the show notes. So that is it. It was a lot, but it's an ambiguous topic. It's right in the name right there. So there can be a lot to it. But okay. So with that said, it is now time for the Death Deck. Woo! Okay, so I'm going to shuffle the cards. And we are going to grab one from the middle. Ooh, okay. Official officiant. Who would you want to officiate your memorial service? It's an interesting question. So for me, I have always said I come from a background in comedy, and I still do improv quite a bit here in Columbus, but I have told all my friends that I would like my funeral to be a roast, and if it's not, then nobody really knew me, did they? I don't know that I would want to have anyone officiate, and I don't necessarily need a pastor, a priest, or whatever. I'm perfectly comfortable with if my family would like to have a religious official come in to say some prayers, last rites, give a little eulogy. That's fine. I don't mind. Funerals are for the living, not for the dead. So I can't tell you what you can and can't do at my funeral because I won't be there. It's a good thing to remember, guys. You're not going to be at your own funeral. And it's just a sticking point with me when I hear so many people say, well, I don't want a funeral. I don't want anybody to do that. Well, that's not really your choice. People are going to have one if they want one. It's not for you, it's for them. Sorry. Hate to break that to you. That might not be what you want, but other people are, whether you like to believe it or not, other people will grieve you. And they're going to want to do it in their own way. Don't tell them how to grieve. Okay. Down off my I get on my soapbox at least once an episode, don't I? Okay. Well, there's something to think about. If you specifically want somebody to speak at your funeral, who's it going to be? Okay. Well, that's it for this episode, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you have an absolutely wonderful week. And remember, grief is yours, your feelings are valid, and grief doesn't always have to suck. If you enjoyed today's episode, please leave me a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening today. It really helps the algorithm so more people can find me. But if you'd like to find me elsewhere, I'm at NikkiTheDeathDoula.com. I'm also on Facebook and Instagram at Nikki the Death Doula. Please feel free to reach out to me there. And if you'd like to support me on Patreon, you can find me at patreon.com/NikkiTheDeathDoula. As always, all the money I receive through my Patreon goes into a fund so that I can provide pro bono work to those who cannot afford my services. You'll also get access to bonus content and maybe even a shout out here on the podcast. Scripts, editing, sound design, production, literally everything is done by me, myself, just me. Except for the music. The music is Cheery Monday by Kevin MacLeod, and you can find license information at filmmusic.io/standard-license. And as always, a special shout out to my best friend and husband for continuing to support me along the way.